JP に初挑戦した時と今回の挑戦では思いに変化はありますか？
ありますね。当時は IWGP というものがピンとこなかったというか、初挑戦の時は藤田さんが持ってて強いやつが持ってる。それに挑戦できる。何も怖いもの知らずで挑戦して惨敗したんですよ。恐怖を知らないっていうのが一番未熟で、それこそいろんな怖さだったり痛みだったり辛さだったりを経験してきた18年間だったと思います。
いろんな厳しい思いや泣いたり、
泣くというよりは昨日も言ったんですけど、流す涙より汗の方が美しいですよと。嘘つかないですから。
柴田さん、今まで経験してきたレスラー人生18年間の響きとは？
Tournaments in wrestling work around a lot of different philosophies, but there is one that is thematically common across all of them, and that is evolution. Whether it's an arc through a single tournament or running through multiple, or even the tournament itself, the constant progression of ideas of who we are and where we want to go is a key element that makes a tournament special. I will be honest in admitting, I did not really think deeply about the New Japan Cup in 2017 and its winner Katsuyori Shibata as I was heading into this video's research. It's a victory that was long overdue in the eyes of the fans and an engaging watch to follow as Shibata goes through Minoru Suzuki, Juice Robinson, Tomohiro Ishii, and finally Bad Luck Fale to finally win the first ever singles tournament in his career. But it's only when you start to peel off the layers that you begin to understand just how unique and bizarrely sentimental the long and arduous story of Katsuyori Shibata is, and that it does not hide behind what is real in wrestling and what's not, and how part of that story culminates with the 2017 edition of the New Japan Cup. Shibata's first opponent is a perfect one to start with, in fact. A wrestler purely bred into the New Japan dojo in the late 90s, Shibata's wrestling philosophy had been distinct in his no-nonsense shoot nature of fighting, in that there is no pretense and theatrics of a pro wrestler and even a hunger for accolades. A brash young man who reveled in his arrogance of being a top fighter with no fear of pain. Shibata was possibly one of the only few young wrestlers of the time who ascribed to the whale-to-the nature of combat sports back then. He did not have this innate fear of being fed to MMA fighters far superior to him. Why I say being fed is because of the fundamental dissonance between wrestling and MMA. That being one is a full-on physical combative sport, while the other is doused in showmanship and drama, with no specific focus on physical fighting. And when pro wrestlers were forced into situations where they had to peel off their characters and stand against legit fighters by virtue of the now infamous ideology of Inokism, it truly hurt them, and not just their bodies, but their standing in front of the audience who saw their idols being pummeled in minutes. Katsuyori Shibata as a wrestler is the embodiment of that dissonance, and it gave him a lot of pride in his younger days, affording him to leave New Japan Pro Wrestling to venture into the world of MMA full-time, right when the company was starting to step back towards pro wrestling after a turbulent few years that brought it to the brink of extinction. But as he got back into pro wrestling with time and matured, he does not slip out of his minimalistic philosophy, becoming almost see-through in his presentation and style, which was heavily inspired by martial art and catch. Not the charm of being flashy, but the beauty of brutality. And there is no one in the current climate that personifies brutality as much as Minoru Suzuki, who meets with Shibata in the first round. Having been trained in the early years of the dojo a decade before Shibata did, Suzuki did not waste much energy in the system. Instead, he head out, and through founding his own MMA promotion Pancrase and taking on the heaviest of hitters from both the worlds of MMA and pro wrestling, forged an insane legacy for himself. And when he seamlessly transitioned into pro wrestling, freelancing and then working full time with New Japan, he was met with reverence and fear from fans and colleagues. Mirror that with the uncertain reactions that Shibata's re entry received, and you will notice how Minoru Suzuki is the most realistic parallel to Katsuyori Shibata ever. Suzuki could fuse into his character. The mean and sadistic persona that he had built over decades gave a reason for the fans to react to him, and that difference plays into the match. Shibata had always been a stoic figure, letting his fist do the talking for him. Suzuki, on the other hand, is the archetypal pro wrestler, wailing himself into a character, and Shibata is not. That is why, when throughout the match, as Suzuki keeps using underhanded tactics and weapons against him, Shibata gains this organic sympathy from the fans who had been built up to fall behind him from the very moment he set foot back into the ring 5 years ago. And around that same time, in the developmental zone of WWE, a young wrestler going by the name of CJ Parker was training to one day perform on the biggest wrestling stage on the planet. He serves years on years before figuring out he had hit his ceiling and would not be able to go any further. And no amount of money, contracts, and big dreams could pacify that desire of wanting the best for himself. And so he asks for his release and uproots his entire life to travel to Japan and start fresh. And by fresh, I mean he joins a New Japan dojo and begins from scratch, even though he had years of experience. And that dedication was not unnoticed by the company, and they allowed him to wear his long dreads and retain the colorful aspects of his personality. A year after his resurgence as Juice Robinson, he takes part in the New Japan Cup and in the second round goes up against a friend and mentor figure, Katsuyori Shibata. Shibata, on the other hand, was not so fortunate. For better or for worse, he was born into a different culture that comes with its own traditions. And with those traditions come rather conservative expectations that an individual had to follow. You see, when Shibata debuted back in 1999, he was destined for greatness as a responsibility was bestowed upon him. As part of the second iteration of the Three Musketeers of Fighting Spirit, a legacy was passed down to Shibata to hold and to honor. That is why it was so shocking when he decided to let go of all of that in 2005, choosing not to follow the path laid down for him. Disparaging his colleagues by claiming they were all salarymen bound by expectations and loyalty made them feel ostracized. And so, when in 2012, when Shibata made his way back into a New Japan ring, announcing he was there for a fight, to the wrestlers backstage, it felt like blasphemy. And instead of being shot at the top of the god, the prodigal son was put through a grinder, starting from the very bottom and aimed to gain back the trust he had lost. And so he fights pound for pound, no matter the night and no matter his opponent, to reach to a stage where he stands opposite a young Juice Robinson on an upwards climb himself and gave him a fight to remember. A quite common trope found across all of Shibata's career is that upwards battle. Almost like his entire career is one big tournament itself. It's exemplified in all of his tournament runs up to that point, especially the G1s. Shibata was a perennial choker, someone who started out really strong to lose his footing towards the end and always ended up near the top, but never there. And it was mostly down to the trust that he was still lacking in the company's eyes. A more spiritual way of saying it would be that he was just not ready. There were still so many who were skeptical for quite a few years after his return, and those were the wrestlers that had to crawl out with the sinking ship of New Japan tied to them after Shibata severed those ties. Obviously, these include top names like Hiroshi Tanahashi, a classmate and fellow musketeer of Shibata, who pretty much shouldered bulk of the weight in getting New Japan back to the top, and who felt personally betrayed by Shibata and the wrestling that he stood for, calling it a dangerous relic of the past. Then there was the third generation, arguably the class that was the most affected during the dark period when Shibata left. Being top names in the early 2000s meant Yuji Nagata, Hiroyoshi Tenzan, and Satoshi Kojima were at the forefront of the booking disasters, taking bullets to their faces. And ultimately, there were those that were brought in to fill that void of strong style that Shibata left open. His childhood friend in Hiroki Goto and Tomohiro Ishii were just two of those names. Each of these classes had a bone to pick with Shibata, whom they felt was returning to hound the glory on the expense of their blood and sweat, now that the company was flourishing under the new command of Bushiroad. But there was one of them who was the first to accept Shibata on his way in. And I mean accept in the most strong styled way possible. Tomohiro Ishii was possibly the closest to what Shibata represented himself, a no-nonsense aficionado of stiff strikes who gave as much as he took in. And that is what all of their matches leading up to the New Japan Cup 2017 have been about. A simple bashing fest with only one agenda, and that is to prove who could withstand the most punishment out of the two. And Shibata probably appreciates Ishii the most for that, because he represents that animalistic drive in Shibata in the purest form. Ishii was also an instrumental catalyst for Shibata winning his first singles title in 16 years, the Never Openweight Championship, in 2016, and making it his own throughout that year. And so, like playing the greatest hits out of their rivalry, Shibata and Ishii meet in the semi finals of the New Japan Cup, where Shibata decidedly proves he was not gonna joke anymore and beats his rival, breaking away from the pattern of losses. And it's a defining moment in his long road to redemption as the fans roar at the possibility of him finally going all the way. And it's this relationship with the fans that was the final hurdle before he found atonement. It was a journey that had been met with skepticism and professional angst, and that is where one of the most dominant tropes in his arc comes up. While Shibata is stoic and never lets his emotions show, it does not have a bearing on the fact that he is one of the most emotional wrestlers in the entire world. Not every wrestler was like Ishii who just wanted to fight. Most of them had a contempt towards Shibata, and it was important for him to mend those fences with each wrestler that felt betrayed. That meant breaking the ice finally with Tanahashi and bowing his head in remorse after emotional rivalries with Kojima, Tenzan, and Nagata, who finally accepted him after a decade of mistrust and contempt. Shibata was a reformed man after each fight, year after year, and the fans noticed this. He never played up to the evocative nature of wrestling in trying to elicit reactions from the fans. Yet the fans organically rallied support behind him, and it was set in stone when 11 years since he had departed to freelance. In 2016, Shibata signs his first long-term contract with the company, in the face of worrying departures of immensely popular stars in AJ Styles and most importantly, Shinsuke Nakamura. In a moment coming back full circle, it is now him showing his loyalty to New Japan after the exit of another fellow musketeer. And it does not end there. Minoru Suzuki comes back into the story as a catalyst, with him invading the rival promotion of Noah. 2016 saw several Noah wrestlers invading New Japan in return to stir the pot. To fight them off and protect the honor of New Japan, Katsuyori Shibata teamed with his former foes in Nagata, Tenzan, and Kojima, now fully behind and literally fighting for his home. And with this comes the close to the chapter of his redemption. So it is fitting when it all comes to a head in the finals of the New Japan Cup, the embodiment of everything that we have talked about stands opposite Shibata. His big, bouldering stance mirroring an era of foreign dominance over homegrown talent at the height of Inokism, Bad Luck Fale had also been a thorn at the side of Shibata in the past, both with one win apiece in head-to-head matches. Their first match happening in the final stages of G1 Climax 24, where a really strong Shibata chokes to Fale and fails to advance to the finals. The 2014 tournament was an immensely crucial step on the journey of Shibata, where the ghosts of the past met with the learnings of the future. With wins over Tanahashi, Nakamura, Kojima, and Ishii, Shibata falls to Fale of all people. Couple that with how Bullet Club represented an anti-New Japan ideology, and we get a perfect stir of story and emotions. The match kind of mirrors that G124 outing, in that Fale wastes no time in decimating Shibata using any means possible. Shibata's stubbornness towards the rigid fighting philosophy ultimately results in him paying the price when he finds no answer to Fale's grenade and fails to make it back into the ring. It is that stoic that one way or another holds him back. So when he faces Fale this time, after going through developmental changes and letting go of inhibitions, he finally uses weapons and even chokes Fale out with his own t-shirt. It was out of character, but in all simplicity, he had had enough and ends it with one final penalty kick. And after 5 years of struggling to make amends and atoning for his past, Shibata, in a heavily cathartic moment, fights back tears to stand in the middle of the ring with his iconic 10-yard stare, bathing in the chorus of chants by an ecstatic crowd. While he did state later that sweat is more important than tears because sweat does not lie, I feel in that moment neither did tears. And this was a culmination for those tears and sweat. The story, however, does not end here. There's a reason I feel the New Japan Cup is a tournament fitting for a wrestler like Shibata instead of, say, the G1 Climax. And that is because it represents the choices that he has had to make and live with. New Japan Cup has a very interesting yet underutilized tradition in that the winner is provided with the choice to challenge for any of the three major singles championships, the Intercontinental, the Never, and the World. However, in all its history, only once was a championship fought for, not the world title, when Nakamura chose the Intercontinental Championship, a story for another day perhaps. Ever since then, there's only one other time where there was an actual conflict between the titles, and that was this tournament, when Shibata was given the three options to choose from. Ever since Shibata returned to New Japan, he had made a very conscious decision not to get involved with the IWGP Heavyweight Championship or its perennial champion of the new era. It's in fact rare to be signed to a promotion for 5 years and only ever fighting another wrestler all of one time in that period. That wrestler for Shibata was Kazuchika Okada, the man that had swept Shibata's one and only friend in Hiroki Goto into his stable chaos, and the man who had arrogantly once stated that the only way Shibata could dream of challenging him was if he won a tournament, and that was 3 years ago. But here is a difference between Okada and the other wrestlers that had Shibata's number, and that is Okada was not a ghost of Shibata's past. Instead, he represented that fear hidden deep in Shibata's conscience, which is if he was truly capable of symbolizing the company the way Okada or his predecessor Tanahashi did. He couldn't think of becoming champion unless he had removed those inhibitions and redeemed himself off of his past. Which is why when it was time to choose between the Never title, the one he was the most familiar with, the IC title that his fellow musketeer was recognized with, and the heavyweight title that he had always shied away from, on the same night where he had found a new fire in his character, he decides to go into the unknown territory of the IWGP Heavyweight Championship.
Shibata さん、今まで経験してきたレスラー人生18年間の響きとは？
俺の18年って多分誰も真似できない18年だと思いますし、今から誰かがやろうとかしても確実にできないことですし、もちろん岡田がやってきた今までも絶対無理なんですけど、プロレスラーとやってきた18年間、どこを区切ってもプロレスラーなんですよ。そこは誰も真似できない部分だと思います。
In the main event of Sakura Genesis, even Okada came face to face with his once brash and arrogant self, now having to eat his words from 3 years ago. It was at this night that the last remnant of Inokism's failure shone the brightest, before dying out. Due in part to the record-breaking 10,000 people sitting in attendance, the highest for this event, proving Shibata's main event drawing capability, but majorly due to the fight that both go on to have. Shibata did not win here, but there was no doubt he gave anything less than 200% to an opponent who had learned to become humble out of this. Shibata's adorable gesture of tickling Okada as soon as the match ended was proof of the fact that he had also finally come to accept the young wrestler whom he had dismissed as hiding behind the character of Rainmaker. A tickle is part of the secret language that wrestlers use to indicate to their opponent their gratitude. It's ironic that such a sweet gesture unfortunately became the last action that a no-nonsense brawler takes in a match. Katsuyori Shibata, as we would all come to know, suffered a hematoma in his brain in this match, courtesy of an errant headbutt, and effectively retired from in-ring competition following a surgery with little scope of returning. While it was tragic for a man finally on a course of reaching his potential as a wrestler, it still was not the end for Shibata. Remember when I said the story is unique in how it blurs the line between reality and fiction? It's usually hard to tell with wrestling who the author is, with all the ambiguity surrounding the industry. Shibata's story takes it a step further and makes it unabashedly clear who the driving force is. Shibata is an immensely emotional wrestler, even if that emotion never shows. For a deeply heartfelt instance, Tanahashi goes back to their match at Power Struggle 2015, after which they buried the hatchet after 10 years of being estranged. Tanahashi recalls walking up to Shibata in the middle of the ring, telling him of how it reminds him of the only memory he has of them together, and that is their days as young lions, in order to move Shibata's heart. What Shibata replies with melts Tanahashi, as he thanks him for protecting New Japan Pro Wrestling and its legacy for the past 10 years. It's the most unexpected thing that Shibata could have said, as Tanahashi would remember. Shibata had a choice to move on from wrestling the way he did all those years back, this time with reasons out of his control. So when he walks into the ring for the first time in months after his last match, fighting back tears and proclaims to the world, "I am still alive, that is all," no one could have known it would be a resurging point yet again for an ever-growing Shibata. That he chose to not run away this time, in fact becoming the head trainer for a new breed of wrestlers at the LA dojo, is testament to the respect he had grown for this legacy that was bestowed upon him so early on in his life. Even growing into a more compassionate person, as seen when he consoles an emotional Okada who had just won the 2019 New Japan Cup, is also a mark of his constantly evolving arc as a persona and as a human. The once stoic and arrogant wrestler, even accompanying Tanahashi to his finals match in that year's G1, is also a piece within that same story. It is as human a story that wrestling could possibly get, for at the heart of it, it talks about self-worth and growth. When Shibata left pro wrestling, it came from a genuine feeling of being at the top of his game. But as he met with failures in MMA and made his way back, it creates a rather strong sense of being unworthy in his own eyes. And that traces back to the part of his mind that acts as a conscience center, the superego. Shibata's moral core had been a cause for hindrance throughout his career, while defining it as well. Not being able to come to terms with change around him is what leads to his downfall. And his tournament arc kind of runs through that journey. His opener with Suzuki represents that moral center in its truest form. Choosing to not beat off Suzuki, who was hell-bent at destroying his arm through any means possible, is what makes Shibata Shibata. Sticking to his ideals of a wrestler is what defines him, but it also lays bare a weakness for his future opponents to attack. Conversely, his match with Juice Robinson demonstrates his compassionate and caring side that his future self would come to embody when helping young lions hone their own skills. But it also shows Shibata to be a victim of his era. When mirrored with Juice's journey as a young wrestler, it was his fights with Tomohiro Ishii that helped give Shibata his legacy throughout the years and represents what his idea of a wrestler should be. But it's his final match with Bad Luck Fale that demonstrates his self-worth and his desire to change in order to reach his full potential. That desperation of letting go of inhibitions is what this match talks about. And finally, making a conscious decision himself of going after the world title instead of being thrusted into that position gives a cathartic finality to Shibata's arc. Shibata's tournament arc, and in large part his wrestling arc, is a story of sweat, tears, and blood. Sweat representing his spirit, tears representing his heart, and blood representing the legacy of being a wrestler, of being the wrestler. But hey, is there a tournament arc from any part of the world that you would like me to cover? Tell me down in the comments for a shout out in my future videos. A quick thank you to Anjan, who created some awesome pieces of art for this video. As always, I appreciate you reaching the end. Please consider subscribing to this channel. See you in a bit. Okay, bye.